When you're flying IFR, there are times when you could use a good co-pilot just to keep the wings level or hold a heading while you get out that new chart or review your approach. Well, as you already know, your Skyhawk's autopilot can do this and a lot more for you. Since you're going to share your cockpit with this crew member, I'll bet you'd like to know a few things about the personality and limitations of your new co-pilot, autopilot. If your Skyhawk's autopilot will be controlling the airplane any time during a flight, you'll want to check it over before flight with the same attention to detail you give to the rest of the airplane. So here's how you test the autopilot during your pre-flight. Since the autopilot depends on the turn coordinator for its input, you'll need to flip on the airplane master switch and let the turn coordinator's gyro come up to speed first. It'll take just a few seconds. When the red flag up in the top right corner disappears, it's ready. Turn on the avionics master switch. This switch supplies power to the autopilot and starts the autopilot computer's self-test. PFT for pre-flight test will light up on the autopilot display. Otto is letting you know he's checking his own health. When it's finished, all the display segments light up and the disconnect tone sounds. That's your clue that the rest of the test is up to you. Next, press the AP button to engage the autopilot. Then move the control wheel left and right to verify that you can overpower the autopilot. If you're going to be the loser in an arm wrestling contest, it's good to find out about it on the ground before flight. If you can't overpower Otto, you can't use the system until it's repaired. Press the autopilot disconnect switch on the control wheel to finish the pre-flight test. Now, when you press the switch, the autopilot should disconnect and the tone should sound. That lets you know the autopilot can be disconnected quickly before it has a chance to make like Patty Wagstaff at an aerobatic competition. You should never use the autopilot unless you have made this pre-flight check. You don't really want to be the star of one of those hangar flying stories that starts, "There I was at 10,000 feet, flat on my back." The simplest way to use Otto is to have him hold the wings level. When you want him to do this, trim the airplane for straight and level flight first. Because your Skyhawk's autopilot is a single-axis autopilot and doesn't have any control around the pitch axis, altitude hold is not an option. Your Skyhawk's excellent pitch trim characteristics will help to maintain altitude once you've trimmed it, but you'll have to control altitude on your own. Then press the AP button to turn Otto on. The roll annunciator will light to tell you the autopilot is now in charge of roll control. It's now in the wing leveler mode and is using the roll control to do its job. But Otto may wander off your desired heading when it's in the wing leveler mode. So if you want to hold a heading, first set the heading indicator bug to your current heading. Then press the heading button. The heading annunciator will light up and Otto will automatically maintain your heading. When you want to change headings, just move the bug to the new heading and old Otto will turn to that heading. The autopilot will start a turn in the direction the bug moves. But if you move the bug more than 180 degrees from your current heading, the autopilot will roll out of the turn and start into a turn in the other direction. That's because it's programmed to turn the shortest direction. That can give you a real surprise if the controller asks you to make a turn of more than 180 degrees and go the long way around. You can avoid this problem though. Just break turns of more than 180 degrees up into 2 or 3 smaller bites. Now let's look at how Otto can track a course for you. Most of your en route flying will be done on VOR airways. So it would be pretty nice if your electronic co-pilot could navigate using a course you selected on the OBS selector. No problem. If you have a GPS in the Skyhawk, you'll first want to select either Nav or GPS on the Navigation Source Selector switch. This will tell the number 1 CDI which navigation data to use when it tells the autopilot what you want done. Then dial in the course you want on the number 1 OBS. Next, press the autopilot nav button. The nav arm annunciator will come on, letting you know that auto is ready to track the course you've selected. You'll also see the heading annunciator flash for about 5 seconds. That's to remind you to make sure to set the heading bug to the OBS course. The autopilot will use the bug setting to compute a 45-degree intercept angle to the OBS course, and then it will turn the airplane to that heading. Now that's a savvy co-pilot. If you've been on radar vectors and want to maintain your current heading until you intercept the nav course, just deactivate the heading mode before you press the nav button. The autopilot will go back into roll mode. Next, press the nav button and then move the heading bug to agree with the OBS course. When you press the buttons in this order, you tell the autopilot to keep the airplane on the heading it was on until it intercepts the nav course. If the CDI needle is more than 2 to 3 dots from center when you select nav, you will see the nav arm annunciator light up. The computer is telling you that you're not close enough to your selected course to start tracking yet, but it's ready to track the course when you get close enough. When you reach the point where the autopilot can start tracking the course, the arm annunciator will go out and auto will capture and track the course you selected. If you're already pretty close to your course, say less than 2 to 3 dots from the center, the heading mode will disengage when you press the nav button. You'll see the nav annunciator come on, and auto will begin the automatic capture and track functions in about 5 seconds. That's to allow you time to move the heading bug to agree with the course you selected. Here's a little tip that'll make the autopilot's flying a lot smoother. As you remember, if you're tracking a course to a VOR, when you get close to the station, the CDI needle swings back and forth a lot. Well, most autopilots, faithful servants that they are, will try to follow it. This makes for some very green passengers. However, the KAP-140 is a lot more considerate of your passengers. It has been programmed to sense station passage and smooth out those swings. But if you're flying with a different kind of autopilot, you may want to press the heading button as you get close to the station. That way, you'll let the autopilot hold a constant heading until you get a solid CDI on the other side of the station. Then, set the CDI and the bug to the new outbound course and select nav to track it. After that, just sit back and let science and technology triumph. Now, the approach mode acts just like the nav mode. When you've selected APR mode, but you're not close enough for the autopilot to track the course, the APR arm annunciator will light up. Then, when you are tracking the course, the arm annunciator will go out. When you're using approach mode, auto will make smaller, more frequent corrections to keep you on track. That's because you want to be a little more precise when you get close to the ground. And yes, the APR mode can actually keep that CDI needle on dead center right to the missed approach point. But controlling your altitude and following the glide slope are strictly up to you. If you have your Skyhawk trimmed for level flight at approach speed, you can do most of your altitude control work with the throttle. A little practice at this will have you doing approaches virtually hands-off, while the radar operators marvel at your tracking skill. Don't forget to move the heading bug to agree with the course you've selected, even if you're tracking a localizer. Of course, if the autopilot is smart enough to track a front course approach, you'd think it could do the same on a back course. And you'd be right. Just set up the autopilot the same as for the nav or APR mode, only this time you'll use the rev button, the reverse button. You'll know that you're in the back course approach mode because when you press the rev button, you'll get the rev arm or rev annunciator light. The thing to remember is that you'll need to set both the heading bug and the OBS selector to the inbound front course heading. That's so the rev mode will know what it is going to reverse. The autopilot will set up the 45-degree intercept, then capture and track, just like in the nav and APR modes, except of course it turns opposite the needle, just like you would if you were flying the back course. The autopilot is a very useful tool, but it won't do everything. Auto doesn't do missed approaches. You'll have to disengage the autopilot by pressing the disconnect switch on the control wheel and start the missed approach procedure yourself. You'll get the disconnect tone, of course, telling you your electronic co-pilot has turned over control of the airplane to you. Once you're safely climbing on the missed approach, you can press the AP button, select whichever AP mode will help you best, and then let auto fly the rest of the missed approach procedure with his fine attention to detail. Since autopilots have been known to try to take mutinous control of airplanes, it's important to follow the manufacturer's operating instructions to keep autos safe and sane. The autopilot must be off for takeoff and landing. You sure don't want to start fighting with an errant autopilot at those critical times. You have to be in the left front seat with your seatbelt fastened to use auto's help. In case the autopilot takes off with a mind of its own, use the control wheel to maintain control of your airplane. While you're maintaining control, press and hold the autopilot disconnect switch on the pilot's control wheel until you're sure the autopilot is completely disconnected. You can also use the AP button on the autopilot, the avionics master switch, or the master switch to remove power from the autopilot system. If you've had any problems with the autopilot, don't use it until it is serviced. But you didn't need anybody to tell you that. Now, sometimes pilots think they have an autopilot problem when it's really the pilot causing the difficulty. Unless Otto has an electronic brainstorm, either Otto should be flying the airplane or you should be. Never both at the same time. If you try to override the autopilot in flight, Otto will fight back. He thinks turbulence is trying to move the airplane around, and it's his job not to let that happen. There's been more than one pilot who accidentally bumped the AP switch and turned the autopilot on without realizing it, then tried to override Otto and wondered what was wrong with the controls. Trying to override the autopilot is particularly a problem on airplanes with a two-axis autopilot, one that has altitude hold. If you push or pull against the autopilot when altitude hold is selected, the autopilot will trim full opposite against your pressure. So if you're pulling back hard, it will trim full nose down. Then when you eventually turn the autopilot off or it disconnects on its own, you'll get a very abrupt pitch change, one that could possibly overstress the airplane. That's why it's so important to never try to help the autopilot while it's doing the job. Either you fly the airplane or Otto does, but never both at the same time. If you have accidentally worked against an engaged autopilot, when you go to disengage it, make sure you have a firm grip on the control wheel and be ready to manually trim out the pressures. When things get a little busy for you in the clouds, you can lean on the autopilot to make your flying safer and a little more relaxed. If you have an electronic co-pilot you trust, you can overlook the fact that he might fly smoother than you can.